Good afternoon, viewers, and welcome to 60 Minutes UNL Edition. In today's show, we will discuss punishment and sentencing, specifically with regards to juvenile offenders, sex offenders, and the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. The juvenile justice system has undergone many changes since its beginnings in the 1890s. The goal of the juvenile justice system is supposed to be to treat and rehabilitate. But is this goal really being addressed on a large scale? There are many differences between the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system, such as how juveniles are referred into the system, like through the schools, social services, parents, etc. And the terminology used in the court system is also different, like sentencing versus a disposition, criminal versus delinquent. However, juveniles can be treated like adults with blended sentencing, which basically combines options available in juvenile and adult court, as well as life sentences. Should juveniles be less accountable for what they do due to age, or is the adult crime, adult time mentality the way to go? There are divided opinions surrounding this issue. The 2005 Supreme Court case, Roper v. Simmons, deemed it cruel and unusual to execute a juvenile. Consider the sentence of life without the possibility of parole. How much different is this from a death sentence? Is that okay, or is it cruel and unusual as well? The Supreme Court says, yes, it is. The 5-4 decision in the case of Graham v. Florida ruled that denying juveniles who have not committed a homicide a chance to ever rejoin society is counter to national and global consensus and violates the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The case involved Terrence Jamar Graham, who was convicted of robbery in Jacksonville, Florida, when he was 16. He received a short jail term and probation, but was arrested again at 17 for taking part in a home invasion. The judge in this case sent him away for life. Justice Anthony M. Kennedy, writing for the majority, said states must provide juveniles who receive lengthy sentences a meaningful chance at some point to show they should be released. More than 2,000 juveniles are serving life sentences for homicide. Stevenson acknowledged that the next legal front might include a challenge on their behalf, although he said some states, such as Texas, already are prohibiting life without parole sentences for all crimes committed by juveniles. Another hot topic in juvenile justice is the Missouri youth justice model. As states grapple with spiraling prison costs and reports of abuse in juvenile lockups, many are trying to recreate a successful Missouri program that boasts one of the lowest repeat offender rates in the country. Critics argue that Missouri's model residence centers are too soft on juvenile delinquents and that some youths may never become law-abiding citizens. In the last 3 years, though, lawmakers and other officials from at least 30 states have visited Missouri's facilities, and several are taking steps to adopt the system. Missouri may very well be the pioneer of a brand new approach to juvenile justice.
I think you've all heard that rape is about control. The deviant and antisocial sexual pleasure comes from making people do what you want them to and by exerting control over them. I found most interesting an article published in Psychology Today in 2003. The article is based on letters written to a psychologist by a high-profile sex offender, and it describes the process he went through in order to victimize young boys. Alan X is a child sex offender who is spending life behind bars for sexually molesting around 1,000 boys by becoming their friend. The first offense was when he was 7 years old, and it was on a 5-year-old boy. Although I had no physical contact with the boy, the absolute high came for me the instant the child undid the snap to open his pants. I felt as if electricity were pouring through me. I enjoyed making him stand there. But the rest of his act, actually taking the pants down, was not nearly as exciting as when he made the first move indicating that he was going to do what I wanted. Slowly, I'd expand my contact with the boy I had targeted, and if my initial feelings regarding his potential were good, I would offer to let him tag along the next time I was heading out from the house to the mall or on some errand. Once I had the child alone, even in these brief initial instances, I fell back to the first step of the pattern that I had used my entire life. I attempted to get him to open up, and I learned what may have been the single most important lesson in becoming a manipulative predator. I learned to listen. After being convicted, Alan X was put on Lupron, an anti-androgen that lowers testosterone, aka chemical castration. Just to give a picture of how strongly the public feels about child sex offenders, 6 states had rape of a child punishable by death until the 2008 case Kennedy v. Louisiana overturned it. An important question we need to address is, how do we deal with sex offenders aside from putting them behind bars or in treatment? They are required by law to register on a sex offender registry open to the public for either life if they are a high-risk offender or if they are moderate low risk, usually 10 years after their formal sentence is completed. In some jurisdictions, the offenders are required to notify their neighbors when moving into a community of their status. They can be involuntarily committed into a mental health facility after their prison sentence, and according to the Sexually Violent Predator Act, the courts have established that the individual who is offended must have a mental abnormality or personality disorder making them sexually deviant and violent. Psychologists assess the future risk of a reoffense. Lastly, the offenders can be subjected to mandatory treatments in chemical or surgical castration. In the past, judges have often given a choice, jail or chemical castration. The chemical castration is a drug taken that significantly reduces the sex drive, like we heard from Alan X with Lupra, and it also reduces the fantasizing of the deviant and antisocial behaviors that turn the offenders on most. It is interesting that even in prison, inmates place child sex offenders on the bottom of the hierarchy. They are seen as the worst of the worst because they victimize the innocent of people who, no matter what, were never fit to defend themselves. Also, many inmates have children themselves, so even within prison they are highly marginalized. There are problems with marginalizing sex offenders. Underneath the Julia Tuttle Causeway in Miami is home to 71 sex offenders. A big problem with punishing sex offenders is the residency restrictions. Get them out is the general consensus among citizens. People want the peace of mind in knowing that people who have the wherewithal to sexually victimize are pushed to the edge of anywhere they could be tempted to reoffend. But obviously this causes problems with past offenders, finding housing far enough from schools, daycares, and churches. For the people presiding underneath the Julia Tuttle Bridge, they don't have much of an option. In the entire county, there is not a single unit available for housing below $750 a month. The men even have to register as living underneath the bridge on their state IDs, and may have ankle bracelets that confine them from leaving the vicinity for most of the day. So for many of these men who have served their time and are on probation, they don't have an option but to be further confined within society and put into a highly stigmatized social group.
The ultimate punishment, death, has long been controversial. But what about the amount of time the convicted spends awaiting his or her death? Death row inmates in the United States typically spend over a decade awaiting execution. Some prisoners have been on death row for well over 20 years. During their stay on death row, inmates are generally isolated from other prisoners, excluded from prison educational and employment programs, and harshly restricted in terms of visitation and exercise, spending as much as 23 hours a day alone in their cells. The issues with prolonged confinement on death row are quickly becoming a hot topic of discussion. So, do prolonged periods on death row violate the 8th Amendment? Well, the United States Supreme Court noted that long delays between sentencing and execution, compounded by a prisoner's uncertainty over time of execution, could be agonizing, resulting in horrible feelings and immense mental anxiety, amounting to a great increase in the offender's punishment. The Supreme Court has yet to accept any case based on the length of an inmate's death row tenure, though many have been brought forth. Justice John Paul Stevens was the first to introduce the issue of 8th Amendment violation in court writings in regards to Lackey v. Texas. In 2009, the U.S. Supreme Court declined review in Thompson v. McNeil. William Thompson has been on death row in Florida for 32 years. He claimed the excessive amount of time he has spent on death row amounted to cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. In an opinion regarding the denial of certiorari, Stevens called the treatment of the defendant during his 32 years on death row dehumanizing, noting that Thompson has endured especially severe conditions of confinement, spending up to 23 hours per day in isolation in a 6-by-9-foot cell. And he has experienced 2 stays of execution only shortly before he was scheduled to be put to death. Justice Stevens added that neither retribution nor deterrence were served in such a case, and punishment of death after significant delay is so totally without penological justification that it results in the gratuitous infliction of suffering. Psychologists and lawyers in the U.S. and other countries have argued that extended periods in the confines of death row can make inmates suicidal, delusional, and insane. Some refer to the living conditions on death row as the death row phenomenon and the psychological effects that can result as death row syndrome. In fact, this is the reason most countries will not allow their citizens to be extradited to the United States. It is not the fact that they could receive the death penalty. It surrounds the issue that if sentenced to death, the person will sit on death row for a countless number of years. The uncertainty as to time of execution seems cruel and inhumane and causes deterioration of the mental state. The length of time that U.S. inmates spend on death row has gotten increasingly longer in recent years and raises questions about the constitutionality of this added punishment. Although the U.S. Supreme Court has not addressed this issue, it has been cited as a serious concern and will hopefully be addressed